Living in a small town certainly has its advantages. For example, you get to know everyone who lives there pretty quickly. If you ever have a problem, odds are there's someone in town with the expertise to help you. Like Jimmy, our local handyman, electrician, and plumber. If you have a household problem, Jimmy's your guy. Got a more difficult problem? Then you probably want Mac. He's our town sheriff, the only law enforcement we have for a few miles. Feeling hungry? Then Sherry's the gal for you. She runs a diner in the center of town and her pie is out of this world. What I'm trying to say is that it pays to know people. Another thing I find fantastic about living in a small town is the sheer amount of nature that surrounds us, untouched by man. Trees seem to grow endlessly into the sky. The nearby creek is crystal clear, not like those contaminated cesspools I hear about in the city. But I think the best part about living so far away from the city is the peace and quiet. It's intoxicating. Occasionally, you'll hear the rumbling of a semi-truck passing by, but that's about it. You could step outside your door at any given time and be greeted with pure silence. I've always found the silence peaceful, like our town was secretly tucked away from the rest of the world. While I do enjoy the tranquility, that's not always the case for a lot of people. I work in our only gas station for miles, and we often get a lot of passers-by stopping there to refuel before heading back out onto the road. Although most of our patrons tend to fill up at the pump and continue their journey, often I'll still get people coming inside, and they'll mention how unnaturally quiet it is in this town. Since I've only lived in this town my entire life, I never noticed how different it is from the rest of the world, but I'll just take their word for it. It just makes me uneasy, is what one of the customers said to me when I inquired further. They said they couldn't put their finger on it. Just something about the utter silence of our town made them uncomfortable. Well, this town makes me uncomfortable too. But it's not the silence that drives my fear. It's something that happened to me when I was a kid. My friend Tommy and I were inseparable as children. We would do everything together. Explore the woods, fish in the creek, play in one of the many meadows that littered our town until the moon signaled our curfew. It was early October when it happened. We were playing together as usual, riding bikes up and down the town, until he got the bright idea to pay a visit to the Blackbriar farm. Now, this farm has a bit of history, but I'll try to sum it up. Basically, the Blackbriars were the first to settle in this town. They were a working-class family, and their main export was corn. They had cornfields as far as the eye could see. The town itself was in the early stages of forming next to the farm. Then, one day, in the middle of October, the entire Blackbriar family disappeared. Nobody knew why. Some speculated that the head of the household, Michael Blackbriar, took sick and passed away, and at that point the farm was too much to maintain without him, so his family left the farm for greener pastures. Others think a pack of wolves or some other animal got to the family and tore them apart, and they were never seen again. Regardless of what happened, the farm was abandoned and had been left untouched for decades. For some reason, our town either didn't have the will or the means to tear the farm down and start anew. So the old farmhouse was left to succumb to time. Even though the house remained empty, the cornfields seemed to continue to grow year after year. They would produce, and even our local market owner would pick fresh corn from the field and use it. No point in letting it go to waste, they'd say. Then the field would wither and die, only to regrow anew the following year. Tommy wanted to go exploring in the field. He had this absurd notion that the Blackbriars had a stash of treasure somewhere on the farm itself. After all, they were a large supplier of produce for a while, and the town didn't have a bank during those times, so they had to do something with all that money. Well, the sun was quickly setting as we approached the edge of the farm. Reluctantly, I followed Tommy into the looming forest of dried corn husks. Our footsteps crunched beneath us as we marched further inward. It was deafening how loud our footsteps were in comparison to the rest of our surroundings. As we pressed on, we began hearing a new sound. It was faint, over the incessant crunch of our footfalls at first. But as we walked closer, the sound grew louder. It was crying. Someone was sitting in the cornfield, softly crying to themselves. Unsure of the situation, I asked Tommy if we could head back, but he shook his head, mentioning that someone might need our help. We found ourselves in a small clearing in the field. On the other side of the clearing from where we entered, we saw it. Or rather, her. It was a woman. She sat on the cold autumn ground. She wore a silky white dress, which had been stained by the dirt she rested on. Long brownish black hair covered her face and shoulders. She sat facing away from us, and the sobs she made seemed to reverberate off the surrounding stalks of corn. Tommy fearlessly approached her and asked her if she was all right. When he did, her sobs instantly stopped. The overwhelming silence returned, wafting over us. She rose to her feet, still facing away from us. I instinctively took a step backwards while Tommy took a step forward. Then she turned, but how she did it sent alarms off in my head. 1 second she was facing away, and in the blink of an eye she was turned towards us, as if she were a glitch in a video game. She raised her head, and her hair parted from her face, revealing a gory facade. Bits of flesh clung to her skull like tape. Half of her jawbone was exposed. Her eyes were gray and lifeless. Dirt seemed to pepper the remaining parts of her skin, which combined to form a sickly brownish color. Tommy and I both screamed. I immediately turned to run away, but then I heard Tommy call out to me. My body reacted on its own and I turned back. Tommy had been grabbed. Her hand gripped his wrist so tight that even from where I was standing, I could hear the bones in Tommy's wrist begin to splinter. Her mouth began to separate and elongate as if she were some sort of snake-like creature. She pulled him closer and raised him up. Tommy struggled to turn his head away from the creature to look at me, and managed to say one thing to me. The last thing I would ever hear from my best friend. Run! And I did. I ran through the cornfield as fast as I could. Tears streamed down my face like a waterfall as I realized I left my best friend behind to die. I made it to my bike and pedaled as fast as I could to the police station. I told Mac everything that had happened. He quickly gathered up a search party, and it was almost every single person in town. After combing the cornfield for hours, they found no trace of the woman, and the only thing they found of Tommy's was a discarded shoe. Weeks turned into months, which turned to years. Eventually, everyone in the town started to forget. It was just another tragic missing child's case. Everyone aside from Tommy's parents and myself, that is. New children began telling stories about the cornfield. How anyone who goes in there is never heard from again. Those stories aren't entirely accurate because I was with Tommy that day, and I made it out alive. Not a single day goes by that I don't regret what I did, and not a single night goes by that I don't have to drink myself into a drunken slumber. For my entire life, I never had the means to leave this town. Until now. Ever since I started working at this gas station, I've saved up enough money to move away from this town for good. To start a new life somewhere far away. Away from the cornfield. And away from the tragic memory of my dear friend. I planned on leaving at the end of October. But 2 nights ago, after I was closing up the gas station, I heard it. The silence broken by the faintest of sobs coming from the other side of the road. My body seized as I saw her, standing there, on the other side of the road. I wanted to believe that she was just a hallucination, but I knew better than that. She was facing away from me, and without even giving her a second to turn around, I sprinted to my car, got inside, and drove away. I'm at home right now, and I wanted to type this up before I leave this place for good. Just so whoever hears this knows how sorry I am for Tommy, and to stay away from the Blackbriar farm. I'm not really sure where I'm gonna go, but I need to hurry. I left my window open and I think I just heard a sob coming from outside. So if I don't make it, remember, if you hear a woman softly crying to herself, just stay away and call the police. Or you might end up just like my best friend, Tommy. I never wanted to stop driving in the first place. I was only a few hours away from home after a long road trip to visit my parents on the other side of the state. They asked me to stay one more night and to just leave first thing in the morning, but I declined. I wanted to make it home early so I could have an extra day to relax before going back to work. The drive itself was as boring and as uneventful as you might expect. I was making pretty good time for the first leg of the trip, but once the sun had set, the storm clouds quickly rolled in. In a matter of minutes, it went from a cool, crisp autumn evening to a complete torrential catastrophe. Rain pelting my car sounded like machine gun fire through my roof, my windshield wipers working overtime to combat the downpour, though even at their highest setting, I could still only barely see a foot in front of me. After an hour or so of driving through this hellish weather, the traffic in front of me slowed to a crawl. Apparently, there had been a large pileup further down the road, and the traffic report on the radio said it would slow all travel on that route by at least an hour. I groaned when I heard this. After a half hour of continuous starting and stopping, I felt the karma of my decision to drive through the night begin to catch up with me. I found myself yawning almost each and every time I had to press on my brakes. Driving in this weather was bad enough for an alert person, but for someone who was drowsy was a recipe for disaster. My wipers streaked once again across my windshield, creating a horrendous shriek as they did so. This made my heavy eyelids shoot open. During this brief moment of clarity, I saw a lone road sign. It read, Ashby Hotel. Warm beds, cheap rooms, an unforgettable experience. Next exit. At that point, I had been sitting in the same spot on the road for nearly 20 minutes, and decided that one night in a hotel was better than dealing with this. I pulled onto the shoulder of the road and drove for a minute or two, cars blaring their horns in disgust at me all the while, before pulling off onto the exit ramp. I was surprised to find that no other cars were doing the same thing as me. I've been in traffic jams before, and usually everyone and their mother tries a different avenue to save some time. The thought quickly faded to the back of my mind as I began to wonder where the hell this hotel was at. I had been driving for 15 minutes. The road turned from a smoothly paved surface to one riddled with rocks and potholes. My car shook violently as I progressed, and I was just about to turn around and rejoin the pack of stationary motorists when I saw it. At first glance, it looked like a simple, oversized house, like one of those old plantation-style homes. To be honest, I wasn't even sure if I was at the correct place until I saw the sign near the entrance. Welcome to Ashby Hotel. After coming this far, there was no way I had the desire or the will to turn around and continue my trip. I pulled into a nearby lot, which only had a couple of cars in it. Not many, but enough to reassure me of my decision. I exited my car, dashing through the rain and mud until I reached the front door. I opened it and stepped inside. When I did, a gust of icy air blasted out at me, almost knocking me back out into the rain. I steadied myself and thought they must have an outrageous electric bill to keep the place so cold. I had to strain to shut the door behind me. When I entered, I was taken aback by what I saw. Though the exterior of the building appeared somewhat run down, on the inside was quite the opposite. The lobby looked like it was used to cater exclusively to royalty. My eyes drifted over to a nearby reception desk, with a man slouched behind it, reading a newspaper. I walked over and asked if he had any rooms available for the night. Without glancing up from his columns, he said in a gruff tone, "It's 30 to stay the night, and we only take cash." "That'll be fine," I told him, though I thought it was odd since this was the first hotel I had ever been to that didn't demand a major credit card. I quickly rifled through my wallet and placed the cash on the counter. In return, he slid me a small brass key with the room number 25 on it. "Checkout is at 10 a.m., he said. "Enjoy your stay." I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the way he said it sounded somewhat ominous. Regardless, I thanked him and made my way up the nearby staircase to the second floor. At the top, I found myself wandering down a multitude of corridors. The hallways in this place made this building feel massive. I found the correct hallway and quickly made my way to my door. Just as I was unlocking my room, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. It was only for a brief second, but it looked as if someone was staring at me from the corner I had just rounded. But when I looked again, I couldn't see anything. I hurried myself into my room and locked my door behind me. Breathing a much-deserved sigh of relief, I turned the light on in my room and was disappointed by what I saw. The room itself was as basic a room as you could get. It had a bed, a small old telephone on a rickety nightstand, a table which wasn't much bigger than the nightstand, and a small chair. I was expecting the same luxuries as I saw in the lobby, but this looked like a prison room. Hell, it didn't even have a bathroom. I was far too tired to complain though, and it did have a bed after all, so I was satisfied. I draped my wet jacket over the only chair in the room to dry, and fell face first onto the bed. My body was quickly becoming one with the mattress, and I was on the verge of blissfully fading into sleep-filled oblivion when I heard a knock on my door. My first impulse was to ignore it, and hoped it went away. But the knocking sounded once again. Struggling to my feet, I stumbled over to the door and looked through the eye hole. I couldn't see anyone. I backed away for a moment, rubbing my eyes before looking once again. Still, no one was there. Thinking whoever it was must have gotten tired of waiting for me to answer had left, I staggered back to bed and laid my head down. This time, I fell asleep without issue. However, about an hour and a half into my slumber, I was awoken to another knock at my door. The knocking only happened once, and I wasn't entirely sure if I'd actually heard it at all. I waited for a few moments. One eye open to my darkened room, the other eye buried in my pillow. 5 minutes went by, and I began to shut my eye when I heard a new sound. This sound immediately made me sit up in bed with my heart pounding in my chest. It was the sound of my door opening from around the short corner of the hotel room. What confused me was, even though I could hear my door opening, there was no light from the hallway outside pouring into my room. Everything remained dark as I sat there waiting for something to happen. A minute passed by. Then two. Then, a face slowly peeked out from around the corner of my room that led to my front door. It was a face of a man, but it nearly touched the ceiling. His eyes seemed to shimmer in the darkness, and his face had this horrific, joyful grin plastered across it, as if it were a child waiting to play a prank on someone. I held my breath as I was unsure of what to do. I found myself asking out loud what they wanted. A minute ticked by, and I received no answer. I started to think that I was actually dreaming, and this was some extremely vivid nightmare I was having. I watched as a long arm scraped the ground of my room, up along the side of the wall, and rose all the way to the man's face. He placed a long, slender finger over his mouth and mimed the shh action to me. Seeing this unnaturally long arm made my heart shudder in my chest. Dream or not, I had to get out of here. I decided that the best thing I could do was to charge this person and force my way past him to get out of the door. I steadied my breath. Then, in a split second, I lunged out of my bed towards the door. I don't even recall running past him, just opening my door to the blinding light of the hallway, running down the corridor and to the reception desk. I found myself hunched over, panting, trying to catch my breath. The receptionist asked me if everything was all right. I told him that there was a tall man in my room. The receptionist just shook his head and said that I probably should just leave. Not like he had to tell me twice. I ran out of the hotel, got in my car, and drove until I was finally home. When I made it home, I took some time to research the Ashby Hotel. What I found disturbed me. Apparently, in the late 70s, a man checked into the hotel, massacred the entire staff and the few residents who had checked in that night, before ultimately taking his own life by stabbing himself in the neck repeatedly. But that's not the weirdest part. The owner of the Ashby Hotel had been the very first victim of this massacre. Looking at a photo of him, I almost couldn't process that he was the receptionist I had spoken to that night. That's not all. The next day, I received a package in the mail. It was my jacket that I had left behind at the hotel. On the wrapping, it said, "We hope you enjoyed your stay." I don't know where I ended up or what even really happened that night. But if you find yourself traveling after dark, and you see a sign for the Ashby Hotel, don't stop. Just please, keep driving. Do you believe in magic? I do. And no, I'm not referring to sleight of hand card tricks, or special illusions utilizing smoke and mirrors. I'm talking about real magic. The kind you read about in fantasy novels or perform yourselves in video games. When I was younger, my friends and I would compete with one another to see who could scare each other the most. Of course, it all started with ghost stories, monsters, and other creatures of the night lying in wait to steal us away, or worse. Those stories did work for a time, but like all things, time slowly quelled the fear in us as we matured. It wasn't until our preteens that a rumor started to circulate around our town regarding a woman who lived a few blocks away from us. Apparently, my friend had heard the story from one of his friends who actually witnessed something strange at the woman's house. One day, in mid-October, the witness had been walking home from school when he saw a bright flash coming from the old woman's house. Her house was a modest home, not too large, not too small. It wasn't overly fancy, and it didn't appear to be a creepy dwelling long neglected. Anyway, he saw a flash of light. After a few minutes, the boy walked up to the house and used a small pot to stand on to peek through the window. What he saw, or so he claims, is that the woman was standing over a table with what looked to be a body on top of it, though it was difficult to see due to the darkness of the room, and the body was completely covered in a dark sheet. He said that she raised a hand to the sky, and in a split second, her entire hand engulfed in flames. She pressed her hand onto the sheet, and the fire seemed to pour from her hand onto the body. In seconds, the body was an inferno on the table. Then, the woman looked up and saw the boy. This caused him to scream and lose his footing. He fell to the ground, scrambled to his feet, and narrowly made it away from the house. A day later, that boy was never heard from again. Just kidding. He was fine, but his family did end up moving away a few months later. His dad had gotten a new job and had to relocate the entire family. Or so I was told. So that's how the legend of our own local witch started. Now, of course, nobody believed the story at all. But everyone, whether it was subconscious or not, avoided going near her home whenever possible. Kids would cross the street beforehand just to avoid being in front of the house, lest they be grabbed and burned alive. Even the mailman didn't like going up to the house. He said something about it giving him the creeps. I thought it was funny to hear a grown-up say those words at the time. Made me feel courageous. The reason I know this was because I was walking home from school and I passed by that house every day. I just happened to be walking by the mailman who was standing at the base of her walkway that led up to her door. I said good afternoon to him, to which he smiled and called me back. He asked me if I wanted to make $5. I asked him what he wanted, silently preparing myself to sprint away from him. It was only about a block and a half away from my own house. I bet I could have made it home before he grabbed me. I was one of the fastest kids in school after all. He said all I had to do was take this stack of mail up to the house and put it in the mailbox. I eyed the man who seemed to be sweating from his brow. My intrepid mind fired back. Make it 10 and you got yourself a deal. The mailman agreed, so I took the cash, the stack of mail, and made my way up the path to her door. As I slid the mail into her mailbox, her door opened. This made my previously fearless heart plummet. She opened the door and I couldn't move my feet. It felt like they weighed a ton. She appeared to be a middle-aged woman, with few wrinkles and long, vibrant red hair. She asked me what I was doing, and even though I couldn't move, I still managed to speak. I told her I was just delivering her mail. She returned a sly smile, asking me if I was a little too young to be a mailman. My nervous brain returned with, "I'm probably gonna retire in a couple of years." She laughed and I nervously chuckled at it, and I felt the weight in my legs begin to wane. She thanked me and introduced herself. She said her name was Rose, and I gave her my name. I then told her that I had better get home before it got too late, and she gave me another smile. Just before I stepped off her front porch, I paused and turned back. I'm not sure what compelled me to ask her this, but my curiosity was screaming. "Are you a witch?" I asked with a slightly less confident voice. Without missing a beat, she said, "Yes, and you better be good or I'll cast a spell on you." I could tell she was being sarcastic, but it felt almost too on the nose to be a joke to me. Anyways, I headed home, and that was the last time I thought about Rose the Witch for many years. Fast forward to now. I'm working a steady job and I now live in my parents' old house after they retired to North Carolina. Hardly anything has happened in the time in between. I finished school and college, I had a few girlfriends, and I've had a few heartbreaks. Basically, life went on for the most part. It wasn't until about a month ago that strange things started to happen in my town. It began with disappearances. Regular people whom I've known most of my life, just up and vanished. Police thought they were just moving away as time went by. But at the beginning of October, 12 people vanished all at once. The town was in a state of panic. The next thing to start happening was rolling blackouts. Our entire town would lose complete power, regularly. It was annoying at first. Then it became scary, as the power company gave a statement saying they could not find any cause to the power loss at all. Every time they would check on the power status, their readouts would say everything was fine. Except it wasn't. There were no lights, no TV, no radio, nothing. The last strange thing that started happening were the strange people I began to see standing around outside. I would only be able to see them from inside of my house through the windows. People just standing rigid in random places outside. I thought they were all doing some strange viral video challenge thing, but when I opened my front door to ask what they were doing, they were all gone. People have reported seeing similar sightings, but the local police could find no traces of anyone standing outside of their homes. I'm not sure why, but these incidents made me think of Rose and the stories people used to say about her. Yesterday, I went over to see her. I had never seen her move away from home and was still listed in the phone book, so I paid her a visit. I walked up to her front door and rang the doorbell. After a moment without answer, I knocked. After another few minutes of waiting, I attempted the doorknob and was stunned to find that her door was unlocked. I pushed the door inward and called out to her. No reply. As I walked around inside her home, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. There were no cauldrons, no tomes, no hex incantations. Not that I would have known what those looked like anyways. My point is, there was no indication that she was actually a witch. Just as I was getting ready to leave, I heard a knock coming from the door inside her house. I walked over to it and asked if Rose was there. The knocking continued. I steadied myself and opened the door. Suddenly, something crashed through the door and grabbed a hold of me. It looked like a person, but their face was horribly disfigured, almost like a zombie. They were shrieking loudly in my face. Their breath smelled awful. It slammed me against the wall so hard I felt my spine creak under the impact. Then, I heard a cacophony of different words being said from down the hallway. In a brilliant flash, this thing was turned into a walking hellfire. It crumbled to ash in front of me as the fire slowly dissipated. Catching my breath, I looked up to see Rose. Now much, much older than she used to be, gripping a cane tightly in one hand, and smoke rising from the other. She walked over to me and told me that I needed to leave immediately. Still stunned at what I just witnessed, I barely could process her words. She was telling the truth. She was a witch. A real-life magical witch. She snapped a finger in my face and I refocused on her. She repeated herself, and I could still only focus on what I had just witnessed. I said aloud, "You're really a witch." The concerned look on her withered face turned to pity, and she simply said, "Not anymore." She told me that I needed to leave the town immediately and to never come back. I asked why, and she said it's no longer safe. She said that there were dark things in this world, things that prey upon the weak and the helpless. She followed a trail of those dark things to this town and settled in. She had been protecting this town ever since. But now she's grown too old and too weak to hold them back anymore. If I hadn't experienced what I just did, I would have called her insane. But I nodded to her, showing her that I understood exactly what she was telling me. Just before I left her house, I turned back to the old woman once more and said, "Thank you for protecting us." She returned that sly smile she had given me all those years ago when I was a boy, and I left. Just as I was getting ready to hit the road, I paid Rose one last visit. Though when I arrived, her door was open and her house was completely empty. It looked as if no one had lived there in years. I'm not 100% sure what I believe, but I know what I saw. I saw a monster attack me. I felt its breath on my face. My back still aches thinking about it. I watched Rose burn the creature to ash with only her bare hand. Witch or not, she saved my life. She saved all of our lives, for as long as she could. And I'm grateful. Although, after I moved back in with my parents in North Carolina, something strange has happened regarding my old town. Whenever I try to call someone who still lives there, I get nothing but busy signals. And when I ask my parents about it, they adamantly tell me that we've always lived in this city, my entire life. I don't know what happened to my town, or to Rose, or why I seem to be the only person who remembers it. But if people start disappearing in your town, or you experience blackouts, or start to see people standing outside your houses at night, leave. Leave now, before you all become forgotten as well. For the last 2 months, everyone in my town has been absolutely stir-crazy about Halloween. Yeah, you heard that correctly. 2 full months of people talking about Halloween, decorating their homes in advance. Hell, even the stores were completely stocked full of costumes, candy, and creepy decorum. Look, I get it. I love Halloween as much as the next guy, but even I think starting that early is a bit much. But I guess some people will like what they like, I suppose. I didn't start decorating my house until it was actually October. I was debating on whether or not to even bother decorating, but my girlfriend, Jessica, was adamant that we embrace the holiday spirits. Yes, she said spirits. With a facepalm and a heavy sigh, I surrendered. Now, there were a lot of choices when it came to Halloween shopping. We had the Mega Mart up the street, which had a section dedicated solely to the holiday. Though, like I mentioned previously, it had been mostly ransacked, and the moment they got new merchandise in stock, it lasted maybe an hour. We drove around for a bit, searching here and there for other novelty shops and the like, though every place we stopped at had next to nothing. Feeling tired and defeated, Jess and I resigned to trying again in a couple of days. On our way back home is when we saw it. A small little thrift shop, with large letters plastered in orange across the rather expansive front window. The letters spelled out, Halloween Extravaganza, with small print underneath reading, While Supplies Last. Figuring it was another dead end, I honestly didn't want to stop there, but I could see the look in her eyes and she wouldn't take no for an answer. So we pulled into the parking lot and made our way into the store. Walking inside, you could instantly tell that this place was a Goodwill-esque thrift shop. Racks of mildewy clothing and old toys littered the walls. It reeked of dust and neglect inside. However, in the center of the small shop was a surprisingly large assortment of Halloween items. Full costumes, bags of candy by the truckload, and almost every possible decoration you could think of, minus the 30-foot inflatable spider. They had apparently sold out of it a couple weeks ago. Jessica quickly went to work grabbing a cart and piling on every small thing she could find. She would shout at me from across the shop, hold up a random item, then nod repeatedly until I nodded back. To say she was crazy about Halloween would be an understatement. We were dragging the overflowing cart to the checkout counter when something in a box of old junk caught my eye. It was a doll. Normally, I wouldn't look twice at a random toy, but this didn't look like any random toy. It looked like one of those Voodoo dolls. What's more is that the doll kind of actually looked like me. It was wearing a tiny white t-shirt, as well as some blue jeans. It even had a bit of black hair that parted in a way similar to mine. Before I knew it, Jessica had completely finished checking out on her own, while I stared at this doll. She tapped me on the shoulder and asked if I was all right. I nodded, then looked back at the doll. She walked over to it and picked it up, mentioning that the doll did kind of look like me. A little bit. She turned to me and said, "Let's get it," and before I could have a say in the matter, it was rung up and bagged. We made it home, and without wasting any time, Jess and I got to work decorating the inside and the outside of our house. I placed cobwebs and fake spiders over our small hedges in the front yard, and Jess put up laminated monsters on our windows. The sun had halted our progress and we called it a day. The next day, Jess had to go to work while I remained at home. I had a few days off, so I had the joy of putting up the remainder of the decorations. A skeleton on the front porch, tossing fake severed limbs throughout the lawn, and stringing lights along the railings and around the windows. After hours of work, I finally finished decorating our house. Even though I wasn't nearly as jazzed about Halloween as my significant other, I was quite impressed with how everything looked. I made my way back inside and was tossing out some of the leftover bags when I picked up one and something fell out of it. It was that doll from before. We must have forgotten to take it out when we had gotten home. I picked the doll up and looked it over. It didn't quite look like me anymore after I had changed my clothing. I sat down on the couch and set the doll on the coffee table in front of me. I stared at it for a few moments, trying desperately to summon up any knowledge I had of voodoo dolls. It was very little, and anything I thought I knew was from movies and TV shows. I got up and retrieved a pin from Jess's makeup drawer and sat back down. I picked the doll up and I pressed the pin into the arm of the doll. Nothing happened. I felt nothing. No pain, no tingle, nothing. I laughed at myself for foolishly believing in voodoo. Then I grabbed my lighter out of my pocket and lit the arm of the doll on fire. The fire burned for a bit, then I patted it out. Still nothing. I wondered what the hell I was doing torturing this poor defenseless doll. In any case, it was a pretty good stress reliever. I actually felt better after messing around with the doll for a bit. Jess got home about an hour or so later and complimented me on a job well done. We ate dinner and chatted for a bit while we watched some TV in the living room. She noticed the doll sitting on the table with scorch marks on one arm and a pin sticking out of the other, and asked me what I did. I was honest with her. I tested the doll to see if it was real, but told her that nothing had happened. She pondered what I said for a moment, then replied with, "At least he's still cute." I chuckled at the remark. I picked the doll up and pinned him to our corkboard in the kitchen and replied, "Well, now you can see him whenever you want." We both smiled to each other and then went to bed. The next morning, I received a phone call from the thrift store while Jess was at work. They called to inquire about the doll I had just purchased. I wondered how they got my number in the first place, but apparently Jess had signed us up for their Super Savings memberships. She's always signing us up for stores that we never go back to. Anyways, they called to inform me that the previous owner of the doll was trying to locate it, and they asked if it was all right if they gave her our phone number. I said it was fine, and they hung up. Around 20 minutes later, my phone rang once again. This time, the voice of an older woman greeted me on the other line. She asked if I had purchased the doll from the thrift store, to which I said yes. She then offered to buy it back from me. Confused at the strange request, I asked her why she would want it. She then told me that her family had recently put her into a retirement home, selling and donating all of her old stuff from her house. It had apparently taken her quite a while to track down where her things had gone to. Then she told me something that I found pretty hard to believe. She said that she was a voodoo priestess, that her mother and grandmother before her each were as well. They would brew potions and make little pouches of herbs to sell to a customer as sort of a side hobby. The old woman said that she used to take commissions from people to create voodoo dolls for them, so they could seek revenge on someone. Truth be told, I almost hung up the phone then and there. She then went on to ask me if I had done anything with the doll. I told her that I had pinned it to my corkboard, omitting the burning part. If she did want it back, I didn't want her to think that I was the one that burned it. The line went quiet for a bit. Then she told me to forget the doll and to have a good day. She hung up, and I couldn't help but stare at the doll, which returned the same confused gaze back at me. I walked up to it, wondering if what I had just heard was true or not. That's when I remembered something I had previously overlooked. Something that made my blood run cold and sent a shiver like needles shooting down my spine. Just as my mind was connecting the dots, my phone rang once again. This time it was my mother. I could hear the tears in her voice, but I already knew what she was going to tell me. I have a twin brother, whom I hadn't seen in years. He's somewhat of a hermit and likes to be alone, so meeting up with him is difficult. She said he was found in his apartment today, and when she spoke to the police, she demanded to know what happened. After arguing back and forth, the police told her that he was found pinned to a wall with a large knife. His right arm was bleeding, and his left arm had been burned so badly it was completely black. When she told me this, I felt my knees grow weak. I wanted to vomit. She asked me if he had called me recently, and I told her no. I told her how sorry I was, and through her tears she thanked me, but I could tell she didn't realize how sorry I actually was. I tried to call the Voodoo lady back using the same number, but when I did, the line just rang endlessly. After an hour, Jess came home to find me sulking on the couch, with the doll resting on the coffee table. I told her everything that had happened. She couldn't believe what I had told her. I didn't blame her. I could hardly believe it myself. I asked her what we should do with the doll, and she suggested that we bury it, though I didn't even want to look at the doll again, let alone touch it. She offered to bury the doll for me, not out of fear or worry, but out of compassion and respect. She took it out to the garden in a shoebox and buried it between the roses. While she did this, I tried to tell myself that it wasn't actually my fault, that some maniac had killed my brother, but deep down I knew I was the maniac. I killed my brother. I had stabbed him, burned him, and pinned him to the wall. Even though I had no idea what would happen, that doesn't make me feel any better. I have so many questions, like who that lady was, or how this was even possible. But what I really want to know is who was the person who commissioned that lady to make the voodoo doll in the first place? I may never find out. I just hope to God they don't make a doll out of me. Next. I've had depression for as long as I can remember. People would often tell me to get over it, to quit being lazy, and to find something enjoyable. But that's the funny thing about depression, isn't it? It's not something one can just get over, nor is it easily banished by finding something enjoyable. Sure, it can help, but depression is a tricky thing that eats away at a person, leaving that person nothing but an empty husk. It all started way back in my childhood. I was always that super quiet kid that stood in the back of the classroom while everyone else played and enjoyed themselves. I would be far too shy to approach anyone, and whenever anyone did try to talk to me, I'd crumble under the pressure. That crumbling would cause me to say the wrong thing or to say nothing entirely. It wasn't long before I was branded as the weird kid in school. This had a major impact on my social status. No one wanted to be my friend. No one wanted to interact with me. Hell, no one wanted to even talk to me. Well, except one kid. His name was Scott, and he was an absolute tool. He was our local bully, one of those stereotypical tough guys who takes pleasure in ridiculing and beating those weaker than him. He had my number from the very beginning. Every day after school, his lackeys would wait for me to come outside and take turns beating on me until they got bored, or on a good day when a teacher would tell them to stop. Eventually, I got smarter and began to sneak out through a side door in the school. I'd make it home unscathed, but that's when the torment would truly begin. I wouldn't have anyone to talk to, and no friends to hang out with. I'd just sit alone in my room and stare at the wall until I'd wake up the next morning and do it all over again. Things didn't get particularly bad until high school. At that point, nothing seemed to make me happy or sad. Colors looked bland to me. Food tasted just as boring. I had no drive to do extracurricular activities, and I lacked the confidence to attempt to speak to others. That was alright though, because for all of his hurtful remarks, Scott still talked and interacted with me, even if it was only to fight or insult me. I tried talking with my parents about it, but they just gave me the age-old, "We're proud of you no matter what," or "You're just gonna have to stand up for yourself." I actually tried that once, and spending an afternoon in a dumpster was my reward. I turned to teachers and counselors next, both of which yielded similar results. There was one place I knew I could be happy, and that was the internet. My mother had bought me a PC at the start of high school, and it was the best thing she had ever done for me. On the internet, I could be anonymous. I could speak with people from around the world whom I've never met before. Or, more importantly, people who had never met me before. I would shut myself in my room for hours on end, playing games and chatting with strangers. It may sound weird, but this was true happiness for me, something I didn't believe existed. I found myself yearning for the end of school each day so I could get home and log on. Somehow, Scott's radar picked up that I was starting to feel happy, and he just couldn't have that. He made it his sole purpose to break me of that happiness. He did it 2 weeks ago at the start of October. Him and his lackeys cornered me in the bathroom, beat me up, and tore the clothes off my back. They then proceeded to shove me out into the hallway as soon as the bell rang. I don't know if you've ever been naked in front of hundreds of people before, but let me tell you, it wasn't fun. The laughter that erupted could have been heard from the moon. They laughed, mocked, pointed, and stared. One of the teachers quickly saw what was happening and covered me with a jacket before taking me to the principal's office. My parents were notified and I was taken home. I sat alone in my room for hours. My parents would occasionally attempt to talk to me, but I'd just tell them to leave. No one could help me. Not even my computer. It was then that I noticed I had a new window on my PC that wasn't there when I left for school. The website said, "Mentally healed. Tell us your problems and start healing today." Below that was a short questionnaire that asked me for basic information. Deciding why the hell not, I filled it out and clicked submit. The next page that popped up was another questionnaire, albeit a more in-depth set of questions asking me about my life and the problems that I was facing. Finally, it asked me to explain in my own words everything that happened, and I submitted it. The screen went white for a few moments, before a new message popped up that read, "Thank you for your submission. Your healing has begun." I thought this was odd as nothing had happened. No one had messaged me. Then I started to kick myself for giving out all my personal information so frivolously. Though, after angrily filling out the questions, it actually helped me calm down a bit. I was just assuming they would send me a pamphlet in the mail talking about inner strength or something. Regardless, I clicked off the website, and since it was the weekend, I tried to relax, mentally preparing myself for the upcoming week. That was until I received a knock on the door on Sunday. It was the police. They wanted to know my whereabouts the previous day and if I had done anything unusual. I told them I hadn't, that I didn't like to leave the house, and that I had a very bad day on Friday. Though they knew that and said it was the reason they were here. They said they had found a body of a classmate of mine in a creek on the other side of town. After researching a bit into his history and speaking with some of his friends, they all seemed to point the finger at me, saying he had played a prank on me and made me upset. I was stunned. Was Scott truly dead? Even though the officer hadn't come right out and said it, I could tell that's who he was talking about. My mother spoke with the officer and told him that she had brought me home immediately from school that day, and I hadn't left my room since. He didn't seem to believe it, but the officer left anyway, saying he'll be in touch. I wasn't sure what to believe at that point, but I'd be lying if I said I felt sad that he was gone. That guy was an absolute menace, and it wasn't just me he tormented. He took out his wrath on everyone who didn't meet his standards. I just happened to get the majority of his attention. Anyways, the weekend had ended, but school was canceled for a couple days surrounding his death. I just spent my time as usual in my room on my PC during that time. It was a few days ago that I received another pop-up from that website. It said, "Healing complete." And below that it had a little attachment at the bottom of the screen. I clicked on it, and what I saw made me nauseous. I almost vomited all over my keyboard. There were pictures of Scott. He was lying in a muddy ditch. His face had been completely ripped off. His eyes were missing as well. If it wasn't for that Letterman jacket he loved so much, I probably wouldn't have recognized him. Another pop-up appeared after a minute, and this one asked me how I would like to submit payment. I was a high school student. I didn't have any money, so I closed out of the website and tried to push it out of my mind. The next morning I awoke and I found that the website had appeared once again. This time it said, "Payment requested. Please submit immediately." And below those words had new attachments. They were pictures of my house. At night. Specifically from outside my window. I instantly stood up and managed to swipe my mother's credit card from her purse. I submitted the information and clicked send. A screen then appeared and said, "Thank you for your submission." I thought I was done with everything. That was until this morning. I went downstairs for breakfast and my mother mentioned in passing that her bank had called in regards to a random $1,000 payment from an unverified third party. She told them it was weird and she hadn't made any $1,000 payments, so she had them cancel it. I'm not sure what to do anymore. Do I just tell my parents everything? Or maybe the police? Do you think they'll help me? Do you think they can help me? I'm starting to freak out and I don't know how to stop it. All I know is that once whoever it is that runs that website realizes the payment didn't go through, they'll be back. And they'll get their payment. One way or another. It's almost here. The time of year I patiently wait for. The time of year where horror reigns supreme. Easter. Just kidding. You know I'm talking about Halloween. For as long as I could remember, Halloween has been my absolute favorite holiday. I mean, sure, Christmas is great too, but nothing beats the rush of going door to door when you're a kid, grabbing as much candy as you can in one night. Nothing beats all the October-themed movies and television shows that return from the dead year after year. And most of all, nothing beats the adrenaline-inducing fear you feel from experiencing something terrifying, like a haunted house or an incredibly scary movie. Over the years, my friends and I would try to outdo ourselves in every way possible. We were all extremely competitive. At first, it started with who could garner the most candy on Halloween night. Then, as we got older, it became a game of who could tell the scariest story. Finally, it became who could come up with the most horrifying costume. I would always win the contest, of course. I've just always seemed to have a knack for creating terrifying things in my mind. But of course, age would rear its ugly head and we would all lose interest in our games. We'd be too old for trick-or-treating, too old for costumes, but not old enough for bars and drinking. Well, not legally anyway. Look, I don't condone underage drinking, but it tends to happen whether you want to stop it or not. My point is, my friends and I were in that awkward phase of life where we truly couldn't enjoy Halloween like we used to. In a vain attempt to keep the spirit alive, we would all meet up a couple days of the month, rent a few horror movies, and devour as much candy as our meager incomes could allow. Though me being as obsessive about the holiday as I am, I wanted more out of that. I wanted to feel that rush of fear we used to feel, something the 100th viewing of Halloween just wasn't giving us anymore. I know other horror movies have been made, but few have been made well. This year I wanted it to be different. I wanted to push the boundaries of what this month was all about. The fear, the terror, the unknown. But I was at a loss for how to go about doing so. Now, being a younger guy, I, like I'm sure many of you, spend a lot of time on the internet. Over the years, I have joined quite a few message boards and forums regarding horror and the like. A lot of the threads on those sites were mostly all about which classic horror movie was superior. I found those all pretty boring, as everyone knows Michael Myers is the best. Hands down. Regardless, I would spend hours searching through posts. People telling stories of how they managed to scare their friends. Most of them would write about how they'd wait in the dark and jump out while their friend was rounding a corner, or put a fake spider on them while they slept. Those were all fine for pranks, but none of those really captured my attention. That was until I read one thread that said, "I scared my friend so bad, he disappeared." Just reading that title was enough to hook me, so I gave the thread a shot. The user went on to tell about a website that he used which apparently caused scary and unexplained things to happen to their friend before they stopped talking to them and disappeared. They said they went to the police and told them everything. However, when they provided them with the link they apparently used, it was inaccessible, as if the website never existed. Then they mentioned caution, and below the text, provided the link. 90% of the comments on the thread were people saying it was fake, that the link wasn't working at all, that they had just made the entire thing up. I, too, must admit that I was skeptical as well. If this story was actually true, why would they subject the internet to this sort of thing, and possibly make more people disappear? My curiosity wouldn't be satisfied until I myself clicked the link. So I did. When the new page popped up, it gave me an error saying the site could not be reached. I laughed at the user's attempt at trying to pull a fast one on us. Just as I was about to click off the page, I moved my cursor across it. My cursor changed for a split second, as if I passed over a small hyperlink button. I spent a minute or two trying to locate it, and when I did, I clicked. A new page popped up in front of me. It was a completely black screen with a message in red text. I sighed at the cheesy attempt, but gave it a pass for that clever trick with a hidden link. The site said, "Scare your friends," and below that had two buttons. The first said About, and the second said Scare. I clicked on the About section first. It brought up a short paragraph that I'll relay now. "Welcome, user. You have found yourself in the presence of ultimate horror. Here we provide a service unlike any other. A service that will bring you so close to the edge of your mind, you might lose it. Enter the required information and begin." A little flashy for my taste, but who was I to judge? I then clicked back and selected the only other option, Scare. At the top it said, "Enter the information for whom you wish to scare." I chuckled a bit. Then I thought about which of my friends I'd like to scare. After mulling it over in my head for a few minutes, I decided the only person who I thought could handle whatever this thing had to offer was myself. So I filled out all of the info, my name, age, address, etc. Then I hit enter. The screen went black for a few minutes before a new message popped up in red text. It said one word, a common word, but a word that made me feel slightly uneasy. It said, "Goodbye." Then I waited. Nothing happened. I waited longer and still nothing. I watched some TV while my parents had gone out for the evening. After a few hours, I was about to call it a day and shut off the TV. Just as I did, there was a knock at my front door. I checked the peephole and saw no one outside. I audibly sighed as I thought to myself, was this truly the best they could do? Then the knock on the door sounded again. I again checked, and again there was nothing there. But wait. Out of the corner of the peephole, I could see something near the bottom. It looked like a leg. What is that? Somewhat nervous, I cracked open my door ajar, and what I saw made me take a step back. It was a body, and it most definitely wasn't alive anymore. It was a man. His clothes were torn and bloodied. His face was permanently stuck in an expression of terror. His eyes were gray, glassy, and looking up at me as if he had died just then. I slammed my door shut and called the police. They arrived and knocked on my door. This confused me, and when I opened the door, the body was gone, replaced by two uniforms standing in front of me. I told them what I saw, and they asked me if my parents were around. I said they were out and wouldn't be home until late. Then they lectured me on proper emergency procedure. I told them this wasn't a joke, but they simply gave me a warning and left. That was about a week ago. Every night since then, after my parents went to bed, things got so much worse. I awoke the following night to someone standing outside of my window staring at me. He wore a black outfit like a burglar, but his face didn't look right. When my eyes finally adjusted to the dark, I could actually tell why. He was wearing a face over his own face, like some Texas Chainsaw knockoff, though it didn't look like a knockoff to me. He just stared at me, and in a brief moment where the dry air caused me to rub my eyes, he was gone, vanished into the night. The next night, I awoke to someone standing in the corner of my room. It was another man wearing all black. I didn't dare move, for I didn't know what he was going to do, but I had my question answered pretty quickly. He pulled out a large knife. The blade glistened in the starlight from my window, and he plunged it into his own temple. I could hear the separation of flesh and bone as the blade pushed deeper inward, though he didn't even flinch. He just maintained his gaze upon me. The man didn't fall. He merely took a step towards me, and I bolted from my bed to my parents' room. I woke them up with panic in my voice and dragged them to my bedroom. There was nothing. No man, no knife, not even a single drop of blood on my floor. My parents said that I was watching too many horror movies. It was rotting my brain. But this was so much more. The next 2 nights, nothing actually happened. I thought my trial was finally finished and I could breathe a sigh of relief, finally getting some much-needed sleep. Then, last night happened, and it was by far the worst. I went to bed normally, but then a sudden jostling stirred me from my sleep. I was lying on a table in a strange room that I had never been in. Leather straps held me in place, while a harness kept my head rigid and my mouth shut. A dim light hung above as 3 men stood around me. They each held various surgical tools. One used a clamp to grab my eyelids and lift them off of my eyes. Another revved a bone saw near my toes. I wanted to scream, but the harness wouldn't allow it. The last man walked up with an oversized drill and pressed the drill bit onto my kneecap. Just before they started cutting and sawing and drilling, I passed out. When I awoke, I was back in my own bed, After a panicked search of my entire body to make sure everything was intact, I ran to the bathroom and vomited. I spent the day hiding in my room. I've pushed my bookshelf in front of my window and wedged a chair underneath my doorknob. I've been too scared to even move, but I rallied some courage and began to type this out. I wanted you all to know what is happening to me. I don't know who these people are or how they keep doing the things they're doing. I don't know how long this will last, but I can't take much more of it. I want this to stop. I need this to stop. If any of you out there come across a link that leads you to a site that says scare your friends, avoid it. All those people who are unable to access the site, I envy them. If I don't make it through this, pass this message along. Warn as many people as you can. Thank you, and don't forget me. It was supposed to be one of those fun, spur-of-the-moment type things. Something spontaneous. A last-minute activity that my wife and I could experience together. We definitely experienced something, all right. And I doubt we'll ever take one of those tours ever again in our lives. As you know, October is in full swing with the horrific holiday just around the corner. My wife lives for this kind of stuff. Every year we seem to do the same exact things. Grab some pumpkins to carve at the local pumpkin patch. Decorate our house together. Participate in the many bar costume contests around the city. And even brave a haunted house or two. I was never really a fan of the latter. Simply because they weren't all that scary to me. I'm not just trying to sound super macho or anything like that. It's just, you've been to one haunted house, you've been to them all. You can only see so many fake dead bodies and rubber masks before you become numb to the whole event. My wife Nikki absolutely loved them, however. She'd beg me year after year to go to as many as we could. And I'd reluctantly agree. Whatever makes her happy, right? However, this year she wanted to try something new and different. I remember getting home late in the evening from work, and when I was barely even through the front door, she slapped a flyer into my hands. She said her friend from work had a few of these flyers and were handing them out. I slumped my exhausted body onto my couch and glanced over the flyer in my hand. Across the top it said, "Experience fear unlike any other. Come face to face with the paranormal, if you're brave enough." It then went on to detail that this was a flyer for a real-life ghost tour. Basically, a guide takes a group of people through a well-known haunted house, detailing the past misfortunes of the owners. And if you're lucky, you might get to see a real-life ghost yourself. So, in layman's terms, it was a con. They lure curious patrons in with the flyer. Then they get the money, flicker the lights a bit, and you go home wondering why the hell you even went there in the first place. Those were my thoughts on the matter, and I told her as much. I was actually surprised when she agreed with me, but said it was only $20, and even if it was all fake, we could still laugh at their attempts. After hearing her point of view, I mulled it over for a bit, and ultimately agreed to it. The day finally arrived for us to take part in our first ever real-life ghost tour. We headed out just before dark and experienced our first real horror of the night. Parking. Trust me, if you ever had to find parking in a city on a Friday night, you know what I mean. Luckily, we didn't spend too long searching and found a lot fairly close to our destination. During our walk over to the haunted house, we joked back and forth about what horrors this place had in store for us. I bet my wife $5 that the lights will flicker, and she said she'd take that bet. Then proceeded to bet me that the doors in the house would slam shut repeatedly. We both laughed at our skepticism, and before we knew it, we were standing in front of the house itself. It was an older-looking house, tucked away in a small back street from the rest of the city. I wondered why we had to park so far away from this place. Then I noticed the no parking sign encompassing the entire street. I thought that was pretty odd, but cities seem to do that quite a lot. Just as I was mulling over that thought, a voice behind me said, "It's 'cause of the house." Caught off guard, I quickly spun around and was face to face with an older man. His face was withered. His clothing was slightly wrinkled and looked to be a decade old. My wife asked him what he meant by that, and the old man continued, "For many years, people used to park on this street, and during that time, their batteries would all be drained by the time they returned," he said. "It was all unexplainable. But eventually, the city just posted those signs to save people the trouble of calling a mechanic." I then asked him if he was part of the ghost tour for the house. He just chuckled slightly under his breath before saying, "You'd never catch me in that house." He then nodded goodbye to both of us and walked away. My wife and I both looked at each other and thought the same thing, that he was one of those planted actors to scare the patrons. Pretty convincing, I thought. We walked inside the house, and in the foyer we were greeted by a young man. He wore a dated business suit. I'm assuming to make the whole experience more authentic. As he approached, I noticed that my wife and I were the only patrons here. I asked him where everyone was, and his response made me start to regret this decision. He said it was a slow night, that not many people want to experience this sort of thing. I was about ready to head home when my wife turned to me and said, "We're already here, we might as well do it." I caved once again, and handed the man the admission. He quickly pocketed the cash and a smile appeared on his face. He looked like he was about to sell me a rock and tell me it was gold. He led us inward to the house and regaled us with its original owners. The house itself was built in the early 1900s by a businessman by the name of J.P. Baker. He said that Baker was a ruthless businessman. He'd cut corners in his factories just to save a quick buck, and this ultimately cost the lives of numerous employees. This mattered not to Mr. Baker, as he was wealthy, and the gripes of some low-class workers were beneath him. That was until the state caught up with him, and after multiple safety inspections, they shut down his factories until further notice. Mr. Baker's wealth quickly began to diminish, and this realization drove him to madness. The man led us to an upstairs bedroom and opened the door. He said Mr. Baker came home one night, fueled on whiskey, and put a bullet in the head of his wife, Francine Baker. When he said that, the light in the room flickered on and off. I felt my wife hand me $5 behind my back, and a sly grin crept across my face. He then led us out of the room and down the hall, and not 5 steps away, the door behind us slammed shut. I rubbed my eyes in an attempt to stave off the laughter and handed Nikki her $5 back. He cracked open the door and said Mr. Baker's daughter was asleep in this room. Mr. Baker walked up, gently caressed her face before ending her life in the same manner as his wife. Finally, we made it to the last room, the son's room. The guide said that young Jacob Baker, age 14, had been stirred from his sleep by the loud gunshots. When his father entered, Jacob attacked him, trying to pry the gun from his father's hands. In the commotion, the gun was tossed across the room. Mr. Baker then pulled out his knife and stabbed the boy in the neck. The guide then pointed to the floor, where a slight discoloration was in the wood, to indicate blood staining. Mr. Baker then retrieved his revolver and pressed it to his temple before ending his life. Even if this was all just a con, the story was pretty intriguing at least. The guide then stepped out of the room, and before we could follow, the door slammed shut in front of us. I told Nikki she wasn't getting any more cash out of me, and she just smirked. Then I felt the air around us begin to drop in temperature, and the lights in the room shut off. Suddenly, there was a knock on the other side of the door. Our guide was still there and asked us if we were all right. I told him it was a nice trick, but if he could let us out now, that'd be great. He then said it wasn't a trick, and when he said that, I heard a noise behind me. It sounded like a footstep. Nikki turned first and screamed at the top of her lungs. This caused me to turn as well. A man stood in front of us, though only the upper half of his body was visible. He was an older man with gray hair and a large hole in the side of his head. He took a step towards us, and I instinctively put myself between whatever it was and my wife. She spun around and began to pound on the door, demanding we be let out. The closer this thing got to me, the more details I could make out. The sweat on the forehead, the bags under the eyes from a night of drinking, and the distinct smell of gunpowder in the air. I put my arm out to shove him back, but my hand passed right through his chest. I thought maybe he was some sort of fancy hologram, but that was quickly washed away when he grabbed me and threw me across the room. I crashed into a couple of chairs and landed on the floor. He was getting closer to my wife. My fight response was kicking in, and just as I was about to stand up, something grabbed me. A small hand. A boy's hand. I looked down and saw the pale face of a boy. His eyes were pleading for help. He opened his mouth to speak, but only blood poured from his lips. When this happened, the man turned to face us. I summoned all the courage I could and charged through him, past my wife, and crashed through the door. When I did, the lights in the room came back on, and the others in the room had vanished. The guide appeared panicked and asked us again and again if we were all right. I just grabbed my wife's hand and we left that house as fast as possible. There are plenty things to do in October, but going on one of those tours isn't something I'd recommend. If I were you, I'd stick to good old-fashioned fake haunted houses from now on, just like we plan on doing. Go inside, they said. It'll be fun, they said. Don't be a wuss, they shouted. Those were the things I heard as I stood face to face with the dilapidated building in front of me. My so-called friends hollering a good distance behind me. I knew I had no reason to be there, but at the risk of being made fun of for the rest of the school year, I put on my bravest face and marched up towards the house. Everyone within a 25-mile range of this house knew exactly what it was, and more importantly, they knew to stay away from it. Everyone seemed to have their own legend that tied to this house, but most of it was just hearsay. Everyone seemed to believe that ghosts, monsters, demons, and psychopaths were terrorizing this house, but not me, which is why I found it odd that my hand was frozen inches away from the doorknob. I was hesitating, for some reason, but wasn't sure why. After taking a moment to catch my breath and clear my thoughts, I gripped the knob and turned. The door croaked as it opened, and I stepped inside. The interior was everything you would expect from an abandoned house. Layers upon layers of dust covered everything in sight. The smell of decaying wood filled my nostrils. There was some furniture, but most of it had been cleared out already. I took a step further inward into the darkened living room. The bet that I had so foolishly accepted was to stay inside the house for 10 minutes. If I could manage that, not only would I receive bragging rights, but also $50 as well. It seemed like easy money to me, and like I said, at the risk of being teased the rest of the year, I figured the hell with it. The house itself wasn't scary in the least, and the longer I spent in there, the more bored I became. I checked my phone, and just as the 10-minute mark was nearing, I made my way back to the entrance. Though when I did, I noticed that the front door had been closed. I didn't remember shutting it when I entered, nor did I hear it close on its own. One of my friends must have ran up and shut the door behind me without me knowing. I grabbed the doorknob and tried to open it, but the door wouldn't budge. I called out to my friends saying they got me and that they could let me out now. I waited for a moment and heard no reply. I would have tried one of the windows if they weren't completely boarded up. In spite of all that was happening, I tried my best to keep my cool. I figured there had to be a back door in this place. I wandered around in the dark for a few minutes with only the dim light from my phone to guide me, through the dingy hallway and past the gutted kitchen. I located the back door and pulled on the handle as hard as I could. There was absolutely no give to the door at all. I was starting to get annoyed at that point and looked down at my phone. I still had minimal service, so I punched in my friend's number. The phone rang, and while it did, I turned to walk back into the living room. I took one step and bumped into something. This caused me to jump back and drop my phone. My phone clattered off the ground hard, but I was too concerned with what I had bumped into to care. In the low light, it was hard to make out, but it had the frame of a very large man. Its body seemed to be covered in some type of black slime. The only reason I thought that was because my shirt was now slick with the same substance. Panic crept up my spine and rooted me in place. In the dark, I couldn't see its face, but its appearance isn't what scared me. Not completely, anyway. It was how absolutely quiet this thing was. It made no breathing sounds. It didn't even flinch when I bumped into it. And it got right behind me without making a single noise. It was like a statue. But it hadn't been there when I first walked in through the kitchen. I shuffled along the wall, keeping my eyes locked on whatever this was. And as I got further and further away from it, it didn't even move an inch. When I was almost into the next room, I made a break for the front door. I grabbed the doorknob, I kicked and screamed for help, though everything I tried didn't seem to be working. I checked over my shoulder while I struggled, and the thing was now standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room. Again, it didn't make a single noise. I was quickly running out of options. I noticed a staircase nearby and charged up it, the steps creaking under my rapid pace. I quickly found an open door at the top and ran inside, slamming it shut behind me. There was a small neglected bookshelf off to the side of the room, and I quickly grabbed it and shoved it up against the door. I thought surely my friends would go get help, and in a few minutes the front door would burst open with my rescue. But that didn't happen. I sat down in the corner of the room and waited, keeping my eyes glued to that door. Minutes turned to hours, and I felt my eyelids become heavy. After one blink too long, my eyes shot open in a panic. I had fallen asleep. In my haste, I scanned the room. Everything was normal. The bookcase was still intact, and I was still alive. I thought maybe they had finally gotten the front door open, but thought I had made it out somehow. I slowly pried the shelf away from the frame and cracked open the door. The coast seemed to be clear, and I stepped out into the hallway. There was no sign of that tall figure, and I considered that maybe all these stories that I heard about this place had just made me imagine it. As I made my way over to the stairs is when I saw it. The front door had been opened. In my haste, I dashed down the stairs. But when I got about halfway, the worst seemed to happen. The floor creaked loudly below my feet, and then gave way. I fell through the staircase into the bowels of the house. I woke up sometime later. When I came to my senses, a shooting pain was radiating throughout my entire body. There was a large chunk of wood jutting out from my thigh. I could feel hot blood running down my leg and tears beginning to well in my eyes. I struggled to stand up, using a nearby wall to support me. Any pressure I put on my wounded leg caused me to double over in pain. The pain quickly took a back seat in my mind, however, as I heard something shuffling around on the other side of the basement, in the dark. This was the first new noise I had heard in this house. Whatever it was, it sounded large. I thought maybe it was that thing I had seen earlier. Either way, I knew I had to find the stairs and get out of this basement. I felt my way along the wall, taking care not to use my wounded leg too much. Before long, my hand located the railing to the staircase, and I hoisted myself up it. About halfway, I heard that shuffling again. This time, it was at the base of the steps. I turned, and I saw the outline of that same figure. I hobbled up the steps as fast as I could and prayed that the door would open when I got there. I grabbed the knob and twisted. It creaked open, and I almost let out a victorious cry. But that was cut short as I felt a hand grasp my wounded leg. The pain caused me to lurch forward, and I fell onto the ground. I rolled over, and with a little light from the living room, I could see its face. It was a skull, but it looked like it was soaked in tar. Strings of viscous black sludge dripped from its head. Its jaw cracked open like it was some sort of snake. I kicked at it, with my good leg as hard as I could, trying desperately to knock it back down into the basement. One kick landed square on its face and the creature reeled backwards. Then, in one swift motion, I kicked the basement door shut in its face. I crawled through the front door and off the porch before my strength finally left me. When I awoke, I was in a hospital. My entire family was surrounding me. Most of them were asleep aside from my mother, who was already awake. She cried tears of joy and thanked the Lord that I was safe. Not long after that, a pair of policemen entered my hospital room and asked me what had happened. I told them everything I remembered. The bet, the house, the creature, though I could tell they didn't believe me. Then they said something that I couldn't understand. Something I still can't understand to this day. They said I went missing 3 months ago. And I told them that was impossible, that I was in the house the entire time, and it had only been at most a day or two. Even though they didn't seem to believe my whole story, they agreed with me that it was impossible that I could still be alive that long without food or water. They also said that they searched the house during my disappearance and found no sign of me. The officers told me not to worry about it and to just get some rest. About a week later, my friends, the ones who had bet me to go into that house in the first place, wanted to visit me. At first, I resented the idea of seeing those two, but allowed them to come in anyway. They both apologized profusely to me, begging my forgiveness, and I told them not to worry about it. One of them was even on the verge of tears. They said that after I went inside, they waited for a few minutes. Then they got a call from my phone, but when they answered, they heard nothing but static. They then tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. They panicked and went to their parents, who then went to the police. They broke the door down and searched the entire house top to bottom, but didn't find anything inside. Then, one of them held out his phone and showed me his call log. There was a call from my number, and the call came in 3 months ago. I don't know how I was stuck in that house for 3 months, or how I didn't die while I was inside. I'm not sure what that thing was, or where it even came from. But if there's anything I'm sure of, it's that I will never go within 10 miles of that cursed house, as long as I live. Tonight is Halloween, and just like every year until now, starting October 1st, my anxiety and paranoia about this night has grown more and more with each day I've crossed off the calendar. Every year, the closer it gets to this dreadful holiday, the more sleep I lose, the more bottles begin to pile up around my house, and the more I begin to double and triple check the locks on my doors and windows. It wasn't always like this. You see, I never used to have a problem with Halloween when I was young. In fact, I actually really enjoyed it. My father would tell me ghost stories every night during October and watch horror movies with me. My mother would spend days setting up our house to be the spookiest house in the entire neighborhood and help me carve jack-o'-lanterns. Halloween felt like one of the only nights where people could really let loose and truly be themselves. I looked forward to it every year. Some of my favorite memories from my early childhood were wandering around the streets of my neighborhood with my mom or dad. Under their watchful eye, I'd walk up with my plastic pumpkin and try my best not to be too scared of all the creepy decorations people had on their houses. I'd gather my candy, and after only a half hour of walking, we'd be back home, just in time for me to watch some of my favorite Halloween cartoons. I was incredibly young during that time. I doubt I was even in school yet, but even then, I knew that Halloween would be one of my favorite days of the year. As I got older, my priorities on Halloween shifted. When I was young, I'd beg my mom to buy me the newest, coolest costumes. But after my 9th or 10th birthday, my requests weren't for costumes, but instead to let me go farther than I had the previous year. You see, at that age, my mind was on one thing and one thing alone: candy. I needed to be able to visit more houses in order to get a bigger payout. My parents gave me more freedom year after year, and eventually, one street turned into two turned into a whole block, and so on. By the time I was 11, I had a full route mapped out, and upgraded my plastic pumpkin bucket for a much larger pillowcase. I knew which houses had the best candy, which ones had the worst, which houses had the best decorations, and which houses didn't even try. My parents even let me go trick-or-treating on my own, provided I stayed close to my friends and was home at a specific time. My route accounted for that, and I had even given myself a little bit of cushion time in case I were to pass a few houses that hadn't participated in prior years, that wanted to get in on the action this time around. The year that I was 12 years old was no different. However, it was the last year that I ever looked forward to Halloween. I had patiently yet eagerly awaited my favorite holiday. I had updated my route from the previous year, and since it would have probably been the last Halloween of my youth, I wanted to make it a great one. After all, after you lose that childhood baby face and start to look like a teenager, the positive reception as a trick-or-treater starts to go out the window pretty quickly. School had let out early, and I remember rushing home as fast as I could to don my costume. I chose that year to be a werewolf, as I wanted something simple and easy to put together. Costumes hadn't been at the forefront of my concerns for years, and you would be amazed what was considered a costume back then. All I had to do was put on my rubber wolf mask, and that was it. I would be rolling in free candy before I even knew it. I dashed through my front door, greeted my mother, and sped past her as I ran up the stairs. I grabbed my mask off my bed as well as the pillowcase I had laid out earlier in the morning before school. I ran out of my room, told my mom I was going trick-or-treating, and she told me to be safe and to be home at 9 p.m. sharp. I nodded in agreement, although we both knew I wasn't really listening. My mind was already on my route and on my master candy-gathering plan. Once I was outside, I met up with a few of my friends from school at the house that we had agreed on. They weren't as focused on the task at hand as I was, but at least they followed through on that much. They all joked at my half-assed attempt at a costume, but I knew they just failed to see the bigger picture. The bigger chocolate and peanut butter flavored picture. After all the jokes were said and done and they were done having fun at my expense, we ventured onward. After knocking one street off the list, I started to get annoyed that my friends were lagging behind. They seemed more interested in talking about video games than getting candy. I knew that they weren't as methodical as I was, but I didn't expect to lose them altogether. But that didn't deter me. I pressed on. and before I knew it, I had lost sight of my friends completely. I felt a little bit guilty, having promised my mom that I'd stay with them, but I was losing precious candy collecting time and they were only going to slow me down. Besides, what Mom didn't know wouldn't kill her, right? The sun had almost completely set, and I checked the time on my watch. It was only 7 p.m., and when I mentally checked the route in my head, I realized I was actually ahead of schedule. Even as a kid, I was really good at time management. Once 8:30 came around, I had hit every single house on my entire route. The bag on my shoulder weighed an absolute ton, but I didn't care in the slightest. Given that I had the extra cushion time that I had accounted for, I was taking an alternate route home, casually browsing for any unplanned contributors to this year's candy haul. To my surprise, the lone house at the end of a short cul-de-sac seemed to have joined in this year's festivities. I had seen this house before a couple of times, but during the day it didn't look like anyone lived there. I don't recall ever seeing any cars parked in front of it, and until now just assumed it to be abandoned or maybe somebody's second home. I didn't usually take that route, so I'd never really given it much thought. However, as I approached, I noticed that it had an array of glowing pumpkins resting on the porch. Everybody knows that if you decorate your house for Halloween, you're gonna get trick-or-treaters. This is, after all, the universal sign for "we have free candy." This house was definitely a wild card, and I definitely got a little excited about the thought of what they might have to offer to trick-or-treaters. I didn't see any other kids around, so chances were high that they'd still have the best stuff waiting to be handed out. I grinned the thought to myself as I might have just hit the trick-or-treat jackpot. I walked up the narrow path and climbed the stairs to the front porch. The candles in the jack-o'-lanterns crackled quietly. I knocked on the door and waited. Nobody answered. So I called out, "Trick or treat!" On the other side of the door, I could hear movement. Heavy footsteps approached the door, and I readied my overflowing pillowcase as the door opened. In the darkened interior stood a man wearing a ghostly white mask. It looked like one of those theater masks. I laughed quietly to myself as I realized I found someone who had the same idea about costuming that I did. Who needs more than a mask, right? It's the candy that really matters. After a few seconds of my laughter, I realized that the man hadn't moved an inch. I guess he didn't seem to find it as amusing as I did. He just stood in the doorframe and stared at me. After a few awkward and tense moments of silence, I cleared my throat and once again held up my bag. "Trick or treat," I said happily. Before I knew it, the man burst through the doorway and grabbed me, hard. I tried to scream, but my cries were quickly muffled by his hand pressing my rubber mask into my mouth. I attempted to swing my heavy bag of candy, but he knocked it out of my hand. He dragged me inside the house, his heavy boots thundering on the wooden floor around us. I kicked and squirmed in the man's grasp, but his muscles felt like cords of steel against my feeble attempts to free myself. I wasn't going anywhere. He opened a door to a darkened stairwell, but between my mask and the darkness, I couldn't tell exactly where the stairs were leading to. As he carried me, I continued struggling and squirming to try to break free from his grasp, but to no avail. As we descended the steps, I could feel hot tears beginning to pour down my cheeks beneath my mask. We reached the bottom of the stairs, and all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears along with my muffled screams. In my haze of fear and confusion, I failed to realize that the man now had a roll of duct tape, which he used to bind my hands behind my back and my legs together. He then tore my mask off and taped my mouth shut, shoving me to the cold concrete floor below. A million things were running through my mind, but for some reason the thought of being late and having my mom mad at me was ringing the loudest. My throat burned as I sobbed behind the tape on my mouth. The masked man walked back up the stairs and slammed the door shut behind him. Lying there on that grimy basement floor, the thought that I was going to die down there began to sink into my mind. I bawled and screamed behind the tape until my lungs burned and I felt like I was on the verge of passing out. This was easily the most afraid I had ever been in my entire life. My eyes stung from all the tears, and after a few minutes, I wasn't able to cry anymore at all. After I took a moment to catch my breath and steady myself, I laid there and started to notice how quiet this place actually was. The ticking of my wristwatch was the only sound apart from my own labored breathing and pounding heartbeat. I started wondering what was going to happen to me, what the masked man planned to do with me. Was this all an elaborate Halloween prank? Oh, how I wish for that to be true. But deep down inside, I knew that this wasn't likely the case. I tried to look around and get my bearings, but it was so dark I couldn't even see a foot in front of my face. A moment later, I heard the footsteps overhead getting louder. The door at the top of the stairs opened and I could hear someone descending the steps towards me. I heard what sounded like a generator coming to life, and the dull fluorescent light illuminated the basement and burned my eyes. I struggled to focus my blurry vision on the figure coming towards me, and on my current surroundings. What I saw gave me a shock. A thick layer of grime covered the walls. There was a nearby workbench with a couple of worn tools scattered across it, and a large pile of clothes in the corner adjacent to it. But what surprised me the most were the Halloween decorations all around the room. Paper ghosts, plastic pumpkins, even little orange jack-o'-lantern shaped string lights. The basement looked like someone had tried to set up a Halloween store in an abandoned warehouse. After the initial shock wore off, I turned my head slightly and saw the man who had grabbed me. He was still wearing that mask, but in the light I could also see he was wearing dark clothing and had a hood pulled up over it. He continued towards me, staring at me from behind that lifeless, pale facade. Out of the corner of my eye, on the far side of the basement, I saw what looked to be another kid. It was a boy about my age, lying on the ground unconscious. He was slightly smaller than me. His costume was disheveled and appeared to be some sort of pirate. His arms and legs were taped in the same fashion as mine. There looked to be blood on the side of the boy's head as if he were hit with something hard. Although it was hard to tell at first, I could see his chest rising and falling very weakly. He was definitely alive, but he looked like he had put up quite a struggle. I brought my attention back to the masked man, and he brought a finger to the lips of his mask as if to shush me. He then walked over to the other boy and picked him up. This woke the boy and he began to squirm and scream through his bindings. The man put the boy on his shoulder, grabbed what looked to be a hammer off the bench, turned out the lights, and ascended the stairs. I thought I had no more tears to cry, but I was wrong. They flowed from my eyes once again as I considered the fate of the other boy and then considered my own fate. I had to get out of here. I needed to. I didn't know what his plans for me were, and I didn't intend to find out. I squirmed my body like a slug over to the bench and quickly threw my weight into it. After bumping into the bench a few times, something fell onto the ground near me with a sharp clang. I silently prayed that the man didn't hear the noise. I couldn't tell what it was exactly, but I turned my body around and felt for it with my fingertips. It felt like some type of axe or hatchet. I quickly began rubbing the duct tape along its edge, and after a few grueling minutes, my hands came free. I freed my legs next and peeled the tape from my face. I didn't know what to do next. I fumbled around in the dark basement trying to get my bearings. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but I knew that the masked man would be the only one able to hear me. I gripped the hatchet tightly in my trembling hands and managed to muster the courage to make my way to the stairs. I didn't know what I was going to do when I reached the top, but anything was better than nothing. I was not going to die in that basement, or become a grotesque Halloween decoration for this psycho. I took another step forward, and above me I heard the heavy footsteps from before. Every step I took up the stairs felt like it would be my last. That the masked man would hear me and open the door to find me trying to escape, sealing my fate. But, to my surprise, that didn't happen. I arrived at the top of the stairs and gently turned the doorknob. To my amazement, the door was actually unlocked. I cracked it open as slight as I could make it and peeked through the crack. I couldn't see much from that angle, but I could see the faint glow of the jack-o'-lantern shining through the glass on the front door only a few feet away. Just as I was about to make my move, the doorknob was ripped from my hands as the basement door was yanked open. My eyes grew wide as I met the eyes of the masked man, that blank expression looking back at me. My heart was in my throat and my hands were trembling even more than before. He reached for me and my body tensed. Out of reflex, I swung the hatchet into the man's arm and knocked it aside. Blood splattered my clothes and face, and the man pulled back, grunting in pain. In an adrenaline-fueled burst, I swung once more and managed to catch him in the leg. He let out a strangled groan through his mask and fell over on his side. He tried to grab at me, but I rushed past him, throwing open the door and bolting away as fast as I could. I sprinted down the block, my lungs burning with each deep and shaking breath. My legs were screaming and I wanted to stop, but I thought that the man was right behind me, so I continued running, not daring to look back. I finally saw my house at the end of the street. I ran up and threw the door open, desperately trying to catch my breath. My mother was waiting in the living room, ready to give me a piece of her mind. But when she saw me, standing there with dirty blood-stained clothing, blood dripping from my face and a rusty hatchet fused to my hand, she screamed. I ran to her, sobbing hysterically as I begged for her to call the police. She held me tightly, asking me what had happened and if I was okay. Breathless and terrified now that the adrenaline was wearing off, I recanted the events of the entire evening to her urgently and frantically. Her face shifted from concern to abject terror. Before I could finish, she darted away from my side to call the police. Within 20 minutes, 4 officers were standing in my living room asking me questions. An ambulance and paramedics waited tentatively behind them, ready to check me for injuries and take me to the hospital for safekeeping. I told the officers everything I knew, starting from the moment I got separated from my friends. The policeman nodded to me and relayed a bunch of numbers into his radio. In a matter of minutes, red and blue lights filled the street and the officers handed me off to the paramedics before funneling out of the door to head to the house where the nightmare began. The next day, I was able to see some coverage of the event on the news from the TV in my hospital room. When the police footage began, the officers entered the house. The door was still open, just the way I had left it. Soon after they entered, an ambulance arrived at the scene a second later. 2 officers exited the house with a small boy in tow. It was the same boy I had seen earlier. He was limping and his leg looked extremely mangled, black and blue from some kind of blunt trauma. He was quickly lifted onto a gurney and shuffled away into the back of an ambulance, and I assume he was brought to the same hospital that I had been brought to as well. I spent a few nights in the hospital while the doctors ran some tests on me. Then, once the doctors were done and I had been cleared, the police came to question me about the incident further. They tried their best to keep me calm, saying that I wasn't in any trouble. But after what they told me next, it was impossible for me to keep calm. They said they never found a masked man in the house, that all they found was the boy locked in the bathroom upstairs. They asked me if I knew what the man looked like, and I couldn't help but have vivid flashbacks of that expressionless mask staring at me in the dark. I asked them about the Halloween decorations in the basement, but they simply shook their heads, explaining that the basement was gutted and all they found was an old gasoline generator and some tools. Years passed by, and with the help of multiple therapists and a truck ton of medication, I was finally able to find some semblance of normalcy in my life. My family was nicer to me, buying me whatever I wanted whenever I wanted. Kids in school either kept their distance or went out of their way to be kind to me. I never saw the other kid in the pirate costume again, but that's probably for the best. Now, most days are fine, and even though they have gotten better, I still have vivid nightmares about twice a week, replaying that night in my head over and over. I finished high school and moved away from that city. I got a decent job and even bought a house. My life was finally back to normal for the most part. However, every October I'm still stricken with panic. I never leave the house during that month, not even to get my mail. I've had multiple deadbolts installed on my doors and windows, and even installed the best security system money could buy. I keep all the lights on in my house with the curtains drawn, and I try to stay awake at night and sleep during the day, though most days that isn't the case. I was one more day away from getting past this holiday again, and continuing on with my life. But tonight, when I looked out of my window and saw kids running by in all their various costumes, I swear to God I saw him. He was standing across the street, standing halfway behind a tree and staring at me. He was still wearing that same damned white mask. But this time, in his hand, he had the werewolf mask I had worn all those years ago. I picked up my phone to dial the police, but when I looked again, he was gone. I told the police to disregard that it was just a sketchy trick-or-treater, and they reminded me to only use the line for emergencies. This wasn't the first time I had given them a false alarm on Halloween since I had moved there. It was probably just another hallucination. I don't sleep very well anymore. I don't know how many kids he's taken, or what he's done with them. I see glimpses of that damn mask in every window reflection. Every time I close my eyes, I see that blank expression staring back at me, holding a finger to its plastic lips. I don't think I'll ever be at peace again. So, as a word of caution, keep an eye on your kids during Halloween. Keep them safe. They never caught the guy. He could still be out there, watching and waiting. Never let your kids out of your sight. As for me, well, I'm going to spend the Halloween night like I do every year, staring at the door, with my shotgun in my lap. And just remember, the scariest thing you see on Halloween night might just be a plain white mask. Happy Halloween.